The crystal in his hand caught the chandelier light and threw it back in small, indifferent shards, and the laugh that followed was the kind of laugh men perform when they are sure of their audience. "I'd rather die a bachelor than marry her," the Duke said, and he said it loud enough that the orchestra, 2 rooms away, seemed to falter for half a beat, as if even the violins had opinions. The friends around him laughed too, because that is what friends do in a ballroom at midnight when the wine is good and the speaker is rich. None of them noticed the woman standing just behind the screen of potted orange trees, a glass of lemon water in her gloved hand, listening with the calm attention of a person who has learned, over many years, that the worst thing one can do upon being insulted is to flinch. She did not flinch. She counted. Instead, she counted the seconds between the end of his sentence and the moment her own breath returned to its proper rhythm, and the number she arrived at was 4. 4 seconds, she thought, to decide what kind of woman she intended to be by Monday. Her name was Marisol Veitch, and she was 26 years old, and 3 weeks ago her father had signed a private agreement with the Duke's late uncle's estate that neither the Duke nor the ballroom nor the laughing friends knew anything about. She had read that agreement herself on a quiet morning in a room that smelled of old paper and beeswax, and she had folded it back into its envelope with hands that did not tremble, because trembling was a luxury she had given up at 14. Now she set the lemon water down on a small marquetry table, smoothed one finger along the rim of the glass as if to thank it for its service, and turned, without hurry, toward the corridor that led to the garden. She did not look at the Duke. She did not need to. She had already, in those 4 counted seconds, seen him entirely. He was tall, of course. They were always tall in the stories her aunts told her. He had the sort of jaw that the portraitists would later sharpen for the engravings, and a mouth that he used the way other men used coins, casually, often, without ever quite considering the weight. His friends, 3 of them, were arranged around him in the loose, hungry way of people who hope to inherit a sentence. The eldest of them, a man named Garrick Olbrey, had eyes that moved across the room like a tax collector's pen. She did not like him. She had not, in fact, liked any man in this ballroom for the better part of an hour, but disliking men was, in her experience, a poor reason to leave a room early. She had stayed because her father had asked her to stay. She had stayed because the agreement, folded in its envelope, depended on her being seen tonight, by certain people in a certain dress, with a certain quietness. The dress was the color of weak tea. The quietness was her own. The garden door yielded with the small, polite click of a latch that had been oiled within the week, and the air outside smelled of crushed mint and lamp smoke, and somewhere beyond the hedge a fountain was performing the same single sentence it had been performing for 60 years. She walked along the gravel path with her hands clasped lightly in front of her, the way her governess had taught her to walk when she was 12 and angry. And by the time she reached the second bench, she had already revised her opinion of the evening. The Duke had insulted her. That was a fact, like the weather. The more interesting fact, the one that would matter on Monday, was that the Duke did not yet know he had insulted her, because the Duke did not yet know who she was. He had said her name without knowing it was hers. He had said it loud and laughing and to friends. By the rules of the world they both lived in, that was a debt. And Marisol Veitch, whatever else she was the daughter of a man who kept very careful ledgers. She sat down on the bench. She arranged the tea-colored skirt over her knees. She looked up at the sky, which had the indifferent, well-bred glitter of a sky that has watched a great many marriages and considered none of them its business. Behind her, distantly, the orchestra remembered itself and began again. She listened, and she thought, very calmly, of the agreement folded in its envelope, and of the 4 counted seconds, and of the precise, unhurried shape of what she would do next. The agreement, to be fair to all involved, had not begun as a trap. It had begun as a debt, which is a more honest word and also a more dangerous one. 12 years ago, when Marisol was 14 and the Duke was a boy of 19 still being scolded by tutors for his Latin, his uncle, the old Duke, had borrowed a great deal of money from a quiet merchant family with a country house and a respectable name, and absolutely no titles to recommend them. The merchant family was the Vicis. The borrowing had been done with the discretion of men who do not enjoy being seen borrowing, and the lending had been done with the discretion of men who do not enjoy being seen lending, and between them they had created a piece of paper that obliged the old Duke's heir, in the event of the old Duke's death, to honor certain considerations toward the lender's eldest daughter, should she, by a certain age, remain unmarried, and the heir, by that same age, remain unwed. Marisol had been the eldest daughter. She had remained unmarried, not from any failure of suitors, but from a steady, private exercise of refusal that her father had indulged, because he understood her better than he understood his ledgers, and his ledgers were the chief love of his life. The old Duke had, 2 winters ago, died of a chill caught while inspecting a hunting lodge he did not need. The new Duke, the laughing one in the ballroom, had inherited the title, the lodge, the chill in the corridors, and, though he did not know it yet, the piece of paper. The paper was, at this moment, in a leather case in her father's study, locked, with 2 keys, one of which lived on a ribbon around Marisol's own neck. She had not put it there for drama. She had put it there because her father, who was 61 and tired, had handed it to her at the breakfast table 3 weeks ago, with a look that said, "This is yours now, and your mother's, and your sister's, and the household's, and I am asking you to be the one who decides." He had said it with toast in his hand. He had said it the way he said most important things, which was as if he were almost embarrassed to be important. Marisol had taken the ribbon and slipped it under her collar and gone on buttering her bread, and that had been the end of the conversation and the beginning of everything else. There was, she should say, no obligation in the document to marry. The document obliged consideration. It obliged honor. It obliged the heir, upon being applied to either repay the original sum, with interest calculated by a formula that filled half a page, or to offer some other arrangement satisfactory to the lender's family. The sum, with its compounded interest, was now of a size that would unsettle even a duke, especially a duke who had, in his first year of inheritance, already discovered that hunting lodges and London houses and racing stables did not, in fact, maintain themselves out of charm. Marisol knew the figure to the nearest shilling. She had checked it herself. She had checked it because she did not, in matters of consequence, accept other people's arithmetic, even her father's, and she had checked it 3 times, on 3 different evenings, in 3 different inks, until the number sat in her head with the cold finality of a closed door. She also knew, because her father had told her in his careful way, that the Duke could not pay. He could not pay this year, and he could not pay next year, and unless certain minds in the north did something remarkable, which they would not, he could not pay in any year his pride would survive. That left the other arrangement. That left her. She had not, in the breakfast room, said yes or no. She had said, "May I have a little time?" Her father had said, "You may have until Monday." He had said it without looking at her, the way he said the things he most wished her to be free to refuse. 3 weeks had passed. Tonight was Friday. The ballroom behind her was tonight's last public appearance of the season for the man who did not yet know any of this, and on Monday at 11 in the morning, her father intended to send a letter. He had drafted the letter. She had read it. It was polite. It was patient. It was, in its quiet way, the most ruthless piece of writing she had ever seen, because it offered the Duke a choice between two impossibilities and dressed both of them in courtesy. The letter had not yet been sealed. There was, in other words, still time. There was time for her to walk back into the ballroom, find her father, and tell him that on consideration she would prefer the other path, whatever the other path might cost. There was time for her to refuse. She sat on the bench in the tea-colored dress and considered refusal with the seriousness she gave to all serious things, which is to say, she imagined it from the inside, as a life, and she asked herself whether she could live in it. She imagined the morning her father told her sister there would, after all, be no London season for her, because the mines had not done anything remarkable, and the Veitch ledgers had a hole in them now where a great sum used to sit. She imagined the small face of her brother's youngest, who liked to be carried on her hip, and who would, in the version of the future where she refused, grow up in a smaller house. She imagined her mother, who had not been well, being moved from the room she liked to a room with a worse window. She imagined all of this without melodrama, because melodrama was a luxury she had given up at 14, and when she had finished imagining it, she stood up and brushed a single fallen leaf from the bench as if to thank it, and she walked back toward the ballroom along the gravel path. She did not, on the walk back, think of the Duke at all. She thought of the 4 counted seconds. He was, when she re-entered, in a different room, which suited her. The card room. Of course, the card room. The men of his sort drifted toward card rooms the way water drifts toward the lowest part of a field, not from any conscious choice, but from the simple physics of who they were. She did not enter it. She stood in the doorway of the room beyond, where the older women were arranged in a half-circle of velvet chairs like a council that had long since stopped pretending to be anything else, and she allowed herself to be seen. Her great-aunt, who missed nothing, raised one eyebrow by perhaps the width of a hair, which was, in their family's private code, the question, well, Marisol inclined her head a degree, which was the answer. Not yet. The great-aunt's eyebrow returned to its resting position, and a small, satisfied silence passed between them that no one else in the room noticed. It was at this moment, with her back half turned to the card room, that Marisol became aware she was being looked at. It was not the Duke. The Duke, she could hear, was inside the card room, narrating a hand with the loud confidence of a man who has not yet learned that a story told too well in a card room is, in the long run, more expensive than losing the hand. The looker stood near the far window of the antechamber, a glass of something colorless in his hand, and he was looking at her with the patient, unhurried attention of a man reading the small print of a contract. He was perhaps 30. He was not tall in the ballroom sense, which is to say he had no need to be, because he held himself as if height were a question already settled elsewhere. His coat was black, well cut, without ornament. His face was a face the portraitists would have found difficult, because it offered them nothing to flatter. His eyes were gray and steady, and they did not move away when she met them, which was unusual. Most men, caught looking, performed a small theater of having been looking at something else. He did not. He inclined his head, the smallest possible degree, the way her great-aunt had, and he went on reading her. She felt, for the first time that evening, the brief, undignified urge to laugh. She did not. She crossed the antechamber toward him at the pace of a person who had merely happened to be walking that way, and when she was close enough to be heard without raising her voice, she said, "You have the look of a man who has already decided whether he likes me." He did not smile. He said, "I had decided I did not, and then I revised." "By what?" she asked. "By the 4 seconds," he said. She did not let her face change. She let the silence hold. He did not fill it. After a moment, he added, "On the path. By the orange trees." "You counted." "I have a sister who counts. I know the look. I did not count," she said. He inclined his head again, the same small degree, and said, of course, "Forgive me." They stood for perhaps half a minute without speaking, and in that half-minute Marisol performed, in her head, the small, swift arithmetic she performed upon any new person she met in a room of this kind. He was not a duke. He carried no ring of office, no ribbon, no order. He was not a merchant, because merchants in this house wore their success more visibly out of a kind of defensive pride. He was not a soldier. Soldiers stood differently. He was, she decided, a man whose place in the room was not declared by the room but by the people in it, which meant he was either no one at all or someone whose name, once she heard it, she would already know. She asked him for it. He said, "Anselm Bray." She held the name in her mind for a moment, the way one holds a coin to the light to read the date. And she found the date. Bray, the Duke's solicitor. Not the family's old man of business, who was 80 and slept through luncheons, but the younger one, the one her father had mentioned twice in 2 weeks, with a small frown of respect. The one who, when Monday came, would be the first person to read her father's letter. The one who would, almost certainly, draft the reply. She inclined her head a degree, which in their world was a salute. "Mr. Bray," she said. He said, "Miss Veitch." So he knew her name. He had known it, she understood now, the entire time. He had known it before the Duke had said it, laughing, in the next room. He had heard the Duke say it, and he had watched her hear the Duke say it, and he had watched her count, and he had, in his quiet, steady way, revised. She thought, this man is going to be a problem. She thought it without alarm, because problems, in her experience, were merely facts that had not yet been arranged. Behind them, in the card room, the Duke laughed again, and again the orchestra in the next room seemed to falter for half a beat, as if even the violins were tired of him. Anselm Bray did not look toward the laugh. He looked at her, and he said, very quietly, "You have until Monday, I believe." She did not ask how he knew. She said, "I have until Monday." And she added, after a beat that was hers and not his, "But the letter is not yet sealed." He absorbed that without expression. He said, "Then we have perhaps a conversation to have before Monday." She said, "Perhaps." He bowed, the smallest possible bow, and she inclined her head, the smallest possible inclination, and they parted as if they had been discussing the weather, which, in their world, was very nearly what they had been discussing. She did not sleep well that night, but she did not sleep badly either. She slept the way a person sleeps who has been given a problem of an interesting shape and trusts herself to solve it in the morning. The morning, when it came, brought a thin, generous light through the east window of her bedroom, and the smell of bread from the kitchens below, and her maid, Tilda, brought tea and a folded note on a small silver tray. The note was not from the Duke. Marisol had not, in any corner of her mind, expected it to be from the Duke. It was from Anselm Bray, and it said, in a hand as precise as a ledger entry, "Miss Veitch, if you would care to walk in the long gallery at 11, I will be examining the portrait of the 3rd Duchess, which is, I am told, a study in restraint. Yours, A. Bray." She read it twice. She set it down. She drank her tea. She told Tilda she would wear the gray wool, not the blue, and the cameo at her throat, not the pearls, and she allowed Tilda, who had known her since they were both 8, to arrange her hair without comment. At 10 minutes to 11, she walked the long gallery of her father's townhouse, which was not so long as the gallery in the country, but long enough, And at 11 exactly Mr. Bray was there, standing before a painting of a woman in a high lace collar who looked as if she had outlasted 3 husbands by the simple expedient of refusing to be interested in any of them. He did not turn when Marisoli entered. He waited until she was within speaking distance, and then he said, without preamble, she is said to have run the estate for 40 years and to have signed every document with her husband's name out of courtesy. The estate prospered. The husband, by all accounts, did not know. Marisol stopped beside him and looked up at the third Duchess, who looked back with the calm boredom of a woman who had been hung on this wall for 200 years and had formed opinions. A useful courtesy, Marisol said. Mr. Bray said, courtesy is often the most efficient instrument in the room. They stood for a moment in the kind of silence that, in their world, did the work of a paragraph. Then he said, I am here, Miss Veitch, in my private capacity, not as the Duke's man. Not yet. I wish to say that plainly, because what I am about to say would be improper in my professional capacity, and I would prefer not to be improper without warning. She said, Please, he said, the Duke does not know about the agreement. I have known for 9 days. I found it in a drawer that had not been opened since his uncle's death. I have not told him. She turned then to look at him directly. Why not, she said. He said, Because I wished first to know what kind of person you were. She let that sit. She did not pretend not to understand it. She said, And now? He said, Now I think the Duke is fortunate, and does not know it, and is unlikely to know it without help. She almost smiled. She did not. She said, Miss Bray, are you offering to help him? He said, I am offering, Miss Veitch, to make sure that whatever is decided on Monday is decided by the 2 people whose lives it will alter, and not by their relatives, their friends, their solicitors, or their dead uncles. She considered him. She said, That is a very expensive offer for a solicitor to make. He said, I am aware. She said, What do you want in return? He said, Nothing you would not have given freely. I want a conversation. One between you and him, before the letter is sealed, in a room I will arrange, with a door he cannot easily slam. I will not be in the room. I will be down the corridor, with a book, pretending to read it. She thought about this for the length of 3 breaths. She said, He will not come willingly. He said, He will come, because I will tell him there is a debt he has not yet been told about, and he is, despite his manners, a man who pays his debts when he sees them. She said, You are very sure of him. He said, I have known him since we were 9. He is, when he is alone in a room with one person and no audience, a different man than the one you heard last night. I am not asking you to like him. I am asking you to meet him without the ballroom. She looked again at the third Duchess. She said, When? He said, This afternoon, if you will allow it. 4 o'clock. The small library at Harden House. The Duke will be told it is a matter of estate business. You will be told the truth, which is that it is a matter of yours. She said, And if I say no? He said, Then I will draft the reply to your father's letter on Monday morning with the care it deserves, and you will never see me again unless you wish to. She inclined her head. She said, 4 o'clock. He bowed, the same small bow as the night before, and he left the gallery without looking back, and she stood for a long time before the third Duchess, who, she now noticed, was holding in her painted hand a small folded document, half hidden in the lace. At 4 o'clock, the small library at Harden House smelled of leather and cold ash, because the fire had been laid but not lit, and the curtains had been drawn back only halfway, so the light came in at the angle of a held breath. Marisol arrived first by Mr. Bray's careful arrangement, and she was given 5 minutes alone in the room before the Duke was shown in. She used the 5 minutes the way she used most gifts of time, which was to walk the perimeter, to read the spines of 3 shelves at random, to note the position of the door, the chairs, the window, and the small writing desk in the corner, and to choose her seat. She chose the chair nearest the unlit fire, because it placed her at a slight angle to the door and required any newcomer to cross most of the room before reaching her, which, in her experience, gave her a useful moment to study them while they were still arranging their faces. She sat. She folded her hands. She waited. The Duke came in at 4 minutes past 4, which was, by the standards of his set, almost punctual, and he came in laughing, because he had been laughing at something in the corridor, and the laugh died in his throat by the time he had taken 3 steps into the room. He had not been told her name. He had been told only that a matter of his uncle's estate awaited him. He stopped where the carpet changed color, and he looked at her, and she watched the small, quick calculation move across his face as he understood, first, that she was the woman from the ballroom, and second, that she had heard him, and third, with a slower and less comfortable certainty, that this was not, after all, an ambush by a solicitor, but something else. To his credit, he did not flinch either. He bowed. He said, "Miss Veitch, I believe." She inclined her head. She said, "Your Grace." There was a silence of perhaps 8 seconds, which she did not count out of habit, but did count, because she had not, despite what she had told Anselm Bray, given up the counting. The Duke crossed the rest of the carpet and sat in the chair opposite hers, not because she had invited him to, but because to remain standing would have been a posture, and he had, in the last 8 seconds, decided to abandon posture. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You do." He said, "You heard me." She said, "I did." He said, "I did not know you were there." She said, "That is not the part for which you owe me an apology." He absorbed that. He said, "No, it is not." He passed a hand once across his jaw, and she noticed that his hand was not quite steady, and she filed the observation carefully, because unsteady hands in a man of his sort were rare and meant something. He said, "I do not know how to begin this conversation, Miss Veitch." She said, "Then do not begin it. Allow me." He inclined his head, which was a thing she had not expected him to know how to do, and she felt, against her will, the smallest revision in her opinion of him, the way one revises the price of a thing upon noticing a mark of quality one had missed at first glance. She said, "Your uncle, 12 years ago, borrowed a sum of money from my father. The sum, with the interest set out in the contract, is now of a size you cannot pay. I have checked the figure myself, in 3 inks, on 3 evenings. I am not mistaken. The agreement obliges you, upon being applied to repay or to offer another arrangement satisfactory to my family. My father intends to apply to you on Monday. I have read his letter. It is polite, it is patient, it is ruinous." He listened without interrupting, which she also filed. When she had finished, he was quiet for perhaps half a minute. He said, "The other arrangement in such contracts is generally." She said, "Yes," he said, "and that is what the letter will propose." She said, "The letter will not propose it. The letter will state the sum and request a meeting. The proposal, if there is one, will be made at the meeting, by my father, in person, to you, in person, on Tuesday, at noon, in this house." He said, "Ah," he said, "you have read it carefully." She said, "I have read it 3 times. He looked at her, then, and she saw, for the first time, the man Mr. Bray had described in the gallery, the one who lived behind the ballroom voice. He said, Miss Veach, I want you to understand that until this moment I did not know any of this. She said, I know. He said, I want you to understand also that what I said last night, I said because. He paused. He said, because I am, in certain rooms, still the boy I was at 19, and the boy at 19 learned that laughter at the right moment is cheaper than thought. She said, that is an honest sentence. He said, I am trying. She allowed herself then the smallest motion of her mouth, not a smile, but the country immediately adjacent to one. She said, Your Grace, I did not ask Mr. Bray to arrange this meeting in order to extract an apology, and I did not come in order to receive one. I came because I would prefer that, when my father's letter arrives, you and I have already had the conversation that letter pretends not to be having. He said, What conversation is that? She said, The one in which you tell me, truthfully, whether you would rather marry me or be ruined. He did not laugh. He did not move. He looked at her for the length of perhaps 10 seconds, which was, by her count, longer than 4, and he said, I would rather not be ruined. She said, That is not, in fact, an answer to my question. He said, I am aware. Give me, he said, until tomorrow. She said, You may have until tomorrow at noon. He stood, then, and he bowed, the proper bow, the one his tutors had drilled into him before he was old enough to resent it, and he crossed the carpet, and at the door he paused, and he said, Without turning, Miss Veach, last night I said a thing I should not have said. I will not say a thing of that kind about you again, in any room, to any person, for the rest of my life. She inclined her head, although he could not see it, and he went out, and the door closed behind him with the small, polite click of a latch that had been oiled within the week. She did not, the rest of that day, allow herself to think about the meeting. She allowed herself, instead, to do small useful things, because small useful things were the discipline her mother had given her in place of a religion. She wrote 3 letters to tenants on her father's country estate, each one answering a specific question about a specific roof, a specific drain. A specific dispute between a specific pair of neighbors over a specific hedge that had, according to one of them, grown 2 feet onto land that was not its own. She read a chapter of a book about the management of bees, because she intended, the following spring, to keep some, and she had decided that whatever else happened on Monday, she was not going to let it interfere with her intention regarding the bees. She visited her mother in the green room and read aloud to her for an hour from a novel her mother liked, in which a young woman of small fortune was, through patience and a steady hand, gradually understood by everyone around her to be the most interesting person in 3 counties. Her mother, who was not strong, listened with closed eyes, and at the end she opened them and said, You are very calm today, dear, Marisol said. I have been calm for many days, mother, her mother said. Yes. But today, you are calm on purpose. Marisol did not deny it. She kissed her mother on the temple, where the skin was thin and warm, and she went down to the kitchens to speak with the cook about a question of preserves, because the cook was anxious about a batch, and anxious cooks, in her experience, produced anxious dinners. By the time she returned to her own room, the light had gone, and Tilda had laid out the dark blue for the evening, and a second note had arrived, this one folded smaller and sealed with a plain wax. It was from the Duke. It said, Miss Veach, I have considered the question you asked. I will answer it tomorrow at noon in person, in your father's house, with your father present, and Mr. Bray, if he can be spared. I would prefer to say what I have to say where it can be heard by everyone whose interests are concerned, and where I cannot, by tone or by ballroom habit, be misunderstood. Yours, with respect. He had signed it with his name, not his title. She read the note 3 times, the way she read all documents of consequence, and she folded it back along its original crease, and she sat for a moment at her writing desk with her hands flat on the wood, and she allowed herself, at last, the small private acknowledgement that something in her had shifted, very slightly, in the course of the day. She did not know whether she liked the Duke. She suspected she did not. She did know that she had begun, against her better instincts, to respect him, which was, in her ledger of feelings, a more dangerous entry than affection, because respect, once granted, was difficult to withdraw. She wrote a reply. She wrote, "Your Grace, noon will suit. My father will be present. Mr. Bray may attend in any capacity he chooses. M. Veitch." She sealed it. She gave it to Tilda to send. She went down to dinner, where her father, who knew everything that had happened in the small library at Harden House because Mr. Bray had, with her permission, given him a brief and accurate account, looked at her once across the table and said only, "You ate nothing at luncheon. Eat now." She ate. She slept, that night, better than she had expected. In the morning, she dressed in the gray wool again, because the gray wool had served her well the day before, and she was not, in matters of consequence, superstitious so much as observant. At 1:45, her father came into the small parlor where she was waiting, and he sat beside her on the sofa, and he took her hand in his, which was a thing he had not done since she was a child, and he said, "My dear, whatever you decide today, I want you to know that the agreement is not the only path. We have other resources. We have my cousin's offer in the north. We have the sale of the South Fields, which I would regret but survive. We have your aunt's inheritance, which she has told me twice this month she would rather see spent on you than on the lawyers who will fight over it when she is gone. I do not want you to walk into this room thinking the household depends upon a single answer. The household depends upon nothing but the people in it, and the people in it depend upon you only insofar as you depend upon them. Do you understand me?" She said, "Yes, father." He said, "Good." He kissed her once on the forehead, and he stood, and at noon precisely the Duke was shown in with Mr. Bray at his shoulder, and the 4 of them arranged themselves in the small parlor in the careful geometry of a meeting that had decided, in advance, to be honest. The Duke did not sit. He stood in the middle of the carpet, and he looked first at her father, and then at Mr. Bray, and then at Marisol, and he said, "Mr. Veitch, Miss Veitch, Mr. Bray. I have come to say 3 things. The first is that I owe Miss Veitch an apology for words spoken on Friday night, and I have made it, but I make it again now in this room, in the presence of her father, because an apology made in private and not repeated in public is a small coin, and I do not wish to be a man who pays in small coins. The second is that the debt my uncle incurred is mine, and I acknowledge it, and I will not contest the figure, which Mr. Bray has reviewed at my request this morning and confirmed. The third." He paused. He looked at Marisol. He said, "The third is the answer to the question Miss Veitch put to me yesterday afternoon, which was whether I would rather marry her or be ruined. The answer I gave yesterday was that I would rather not be ruined, and Miss Veitch correctly noted that this was not, in fact, an answer to her question. I have considered it overnight. The answer to her question is that I would rather marry her." He said it the way one says a sentence one has rehearsed not for effect, but for accuracy. He said it without flourish. He said it looking at her. He said, "I would add, because I think Miss Veitch deserves the addition, that I do not say this because she is the alternative to ruin. I say it because in the course of one conversation in a small library yesterday afternoon, I learned more about how to be addressed by another person than I have learned in the 7 years since I came of age, and I would prefer, if she will allow it, to go on being addressed by her for the rest of my life." He stopped. The room was very quiet. Mr. Bray was looking at the carpet with the careful neutrality of a man who had, professionally, no opinion. Her father was looking at her. She was looking at the Duke. She said, after a moment that she did not count, Your Grace, "That is a great deal to say standing up." He inclined his head. He said, "I am aware. May I sit?" She said, "Please." She did not, in that moment, say yes. She had not, in any of her arithmetic of the last 3 weeks, allowed herself to imagine the moment of saying yes, because she had not wanted to predispose herself to it, and she had been raised by a father who believed that the worst decisions in any household were the ones reached by people who had already, secretly, decided. She said, "Your Grace, I would like to ask you 3 questions before I answer yours." He said, "Please," she said, "the first. If I say yes today and the agreement is satisfied, and the debt is, in the manner of these things, considered discharged, will you, in any room at any time at any future date, allow it to be said in your hearing that you married me because of the debt?" He did not hesitate. He said, "No. I will correct any person who suggests it, including, if necessary, the persons who were in the ballroom on Friday night, by name, in writing, with my seal." She said, "The second. If I say yes today, will you allow my mother, who is not well, to remain in the green room at our country house for as long as she lives, and will you allow my sister, who is 16 and would like to study, the use of any library in any house you own, including the one at the lodge in the north, which I am told has a very fine collection of old maps?" He said, "Yes to all of it, and I will add, without being asked, that any cousin or aunt of yours who wishes to visit any of my houses for any reason at any time will be welcome, and I will inform my housekeepers in writing to that effect this week." She said, "The third." She paused then, for the first time, and she allowed the pause to be a real one, not a counted one. She said, "Will you, when we are next in a ballroom together, and your friends are arranged around you in the loose, hungry way of people hoping to inherit a sentence, will you remember that the woman behind the orange trees can hear you?" He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Miss Veitch, I will remember it for the rest of my life. I will remember it, in fact, even when there is no woman behind the orange trees, because I would prefer not to be the kind of man who needs one to be there in order to behave." She inclined her head. She did not, even now, say yes. She said, "Father." Her father said, "My dear, this is yours." She said, "Mr. Bray." Mr. Bray looked up from the carpet. He said, "Miss Veitch." She said, "The letter my father drafted, the one that was to be sent on Monday morning, is still in his study. It has not been sealed." Mr. Bray said, "I know." She said, "I would like it not to be sent. I would like, instead, a different document, drafted this afternoon, signed by His Grace and by my father, in which His Grace acknowledges the debt as I have stated it, in which the debt is set aside by mutual agreement in consideration of a marriage to take place at a date Miss Veitch shall set, not before 3 months from today, and not after 12, in which the household arrangements I have just named are written in plain language and witnessed, and in which there is no mention, in any clause, of any obligation on the part of either party that is not freely undertaken in the presence of the other. Mr. Bray, can you draft that today?" Mr. Bray said, "I can draft it within the hour." She said, "Then please do." She turned then to the Duke, who had been very still on the sofa across from her, and she said, "Your Grace." He said, "Miss Veitch." She said, "Yes." He did not smile. He did not stand. He let the words sit in the room for a moment. the way a person lets a struck bell finish its sound before speaking over it. And then he said, quietly, "Thank you." And then he said, "May I tell you something, Miss Veach?" She said, "Please," he said. On Friday night, after I had said the thing I said, I went into the card room and I lost a great deal of money, more than I could afford. And I did not, until this moment, understand why. I understand now. I lost because I had spent the evening being a man I did not, when I sat down at the table, particularly wish to be, and a man who is being someone he does not wish to be is a poor judge of cards. She said, "That is, I think, the most honest thing you have said since you came into this house." He said, "I am trying to make a habit of it." She said, "I will hold you to the habit." He said, "Please." They sat for a moment in the small parlor in the careful geometry of 4 people who had, by the simple expedient of speaking plainly to one another in a single hour, dismantled a debt of 12 years' standing and assembled, in its place, the beginnings of a household. Mr. Bray rose. He said, "With your permission, I will go and draft." Her father said, "The study is yours." Mr. Bray bowed and went, and as he passed her chair he paused for the briefest moment, no longer than the width of a breath, and he said, very low, 4 seconds was enough. She did not look up. She said, equally low, "I know." He went. Her father went after him, on some kindly pretext that fooled no one and was meant to fool no one, and the small parlor was, for a moment, hers and the Duke's alone. He said, "Miss Veach." She said, "You may, in this room, when we are alone, call me Marisol, if you wish." He said, Marisoli. He said it the way a man says a word he intends to learn by heart. He said, "Will you, when we are alone, call me by mine?" She said, "What is your name?" He said, "In the ballroom and in the cards rooms and in the corridors of the houses I have inherited, my name is the title. In this room, with you, my name is Theo." She said, "Theo." He said, "Thank you." She did not then smile, but she allowed her face the small, unobserved permission of softening, and she said, "Theo, we are going to be, I suspect, a very quiet sort of married couple." He said, "I had hoped so." She said, "We will need to learn how to be quiet together, because you are loud by training, and I am quiet by training, and the meeting in the middle will not, I think, be effortless." He said, "I am willing to be trained." She said, "That is the second most honest thing you have said in this house." He said, "I am trying." She said, "I know." The wedding, when it came in the early autumn, 11 months later, which was within the window the document had specified, and slightly nearer the end of it than the beginning, because Marisol, in setting the date, had taken the trouble to consult her mother's strength, the harvest schedule on the country estate, the bees she had begun to keep in the spring, and her own private sense of when she would be ready, in that order. The Duke, when consulted, had said only that he was at her disposal in the matter of dates and would arrange his life accordingly, and he had, to his credit, done exactly that. They were married in the small chapel at Hardin, not in the great church in the city, because Marisol had said early on that she would prefer a room she could see across, without raising her voice, and the Duke had said that suited him entirely. And the city, which had expected a spectacle, had been obliged, in its disappointment, to invent one in its imagination. Garrick Olbrey, the friend with the eyes like a tax collector's pen, was not invited. The Duke had, of his own initiative and without prompting, written to him in the spring and informed him, in a letter Marisol was permitted to read, but was not asked to approve, that the friendship was at an end, with thanks for past kindnesses and no expectation of future ones. Garrick Olbree had replied with a stiff and wounded note that mentioned 3 times that he had always known the Duke would marry above his sense, which the Duke had shown to Marisol over breakfast with an expression that, for the first time in their acquaintance, made her laugh aloud. She had laughed for the length of perhaps 4 seconds, which she had counted because old habits are not abandoned, they are merely repurposed. The chapel was full of people who had earned the right to be in it, which is a smaller crowd than the right to be invited to a wedding usually produces, and the bees, although not present, were represented in spirit by a small spray of late lavender pinned to Marisol's dress, because the bees, that summer, had loved the lavender best of all the things she had planted, and she had felt it would be discourteous to marry without them. Her mother sat in the front row, in a chair brought specially from the green room, with a blanket across her knees and a face that had, in the months since the betrothal, recovered something it had not had in years, which was the small, private brightness of a woman who has stopped being afraid of what will happen to her children. Her sister sat beside her, 16 and serious, with a book half hidden in her lap that turned out, later, to be a treatise on the management of moors, because she had decided, at 15, to become the kind of woman who understood land, and she had announced this decision to Marisol in the carriage on the way down, with the calm certainty of a person who had thought about it for some time. Mr. Bray stood at the back of the chapel, beside her father, and he did not, throughout the ceremony, look at anyone except, once, at Marisol when she came down the short aisle, and the look he gave her was the same look he had given her in the long gallery before the painting of the third Duchess, which was the look of a man reading the small print of a contract and finding it. Against expectation, satisfactory, the Duke, when she reached him, was very still. He said, very low, so that only she could hear, "You came." She said, equally low, "I said I would." He said, "I know. I am telling you that you came." She said, "Theo." He said, Marisol, the chaplain, who was old and had married 3 generations of the Duke's family and 1 generation of hers, conducted the service in a voice that suggested he had given up, decades ago, the ambition to be impressed by any wedding, which was, in her opinion, the correct attitude for a man in his position, and which made him, by accident, the best officiant they could have asked for. They were pronounced married. The Duke did not laugh. He bent his head to hers, the smallest possible degree, and he said, in a voice meant for her alone, "Thank you for the 4 seconds." She said, in a voice meant for him alone, "Thank you for the rest of them." They walked back down the aisle together, and outside the chapel the autumn light was the color of weak tea, which she noted privately and did not mention, and the bees, somewhere across the lawn in their pale hives, went on about the business of bees, which is the only business in the world that is conducted entirely without ceremony and entirely without doubt. Of the others, the news, as it eventually traveled, was as follows. Garrick Olbree married, the following spring, a young woman with a great deal of money and a small interest in him, and the marriage was, by all accounts, exactly as comfortable as both parties had bargained for, which is to say not very, and he was rarely heard from again in any room Marisol or the Duke entered, which suited everyone, including, it seemed, Garrick Olbree. The other 2 friends from the ballroom, who had laughed at the original sentence and whose names, like most names in such crowds, had been forgettable even at the time, drifted apart from each other, and from the Duke in the gentle, undramatic way that such friendships drift when one of the parties has begun to take himself seriously. And they were last reported, separately, in the South, doing whatever it is that men of their kind do in the South, which is mostly to be unhappy in better weather. Mr. Bray, Anselm Bray, did not, as Marisol had feared in some private corner of her mind, fade from their lives. He remained the Duke's man of business, and he became, within a year, also her own, and he married, the following summer, a quiet woman who taught the village children to read, and who had, by all accounts, a smile that he had not previously known himself capable of provoking. He named his eldest daughter, when she came, Mara, which was not Marisol's name and not his wife's, and when Marisol, visiting them one afternoon, raised an eyebrow by the width of a hair at the cradle, he said only, "It is a good short name." And she did not press him, because a good short name is in fact a good short name, and a man is entitled to his small private gratitudes. Her sister, in due course, did indeed become the kind of woman who understood land, and she ran, by the age of 24, 2 of the Duke's estates with a competence that astonished his agents and amused his wife, and she married, eventually. A quiet man who painted watercolors of the moors she managed, and who understood, without needing to be told, that he had been chosen partly for his willingness to be the quieter person in the room. Her mother lived 8 more years in the green room at the country house, longer than the doctors had predicted, and she died on a morning in early spring, with the window open and a smell of crushed mint in the air, and Marisol, who had not cried at the wedding and had not cried at the births of her own children, cried then for a long time, and the Duke sat with her and did not, by word or by gesture, attempt to shorten the crying, which was, she thought afterward, the single greatest kindness of their marriage. They had 3 children. Theo, in time, became, to his own quiet surprise, and to the louder surprise of his old set, a man whose name was spoken with respect in rooms where it had once been spoken with amusement. He never, in any room in which Marisoli stood or in which she did not, allowed it to be said that he had married her because of the debt, and on the 2 occasions in his life that someone tried, he corrected them, by name, in writing, with his seal, as he had promised. He kept, in a locked drawer of his study, a copy of the original agreement, and he showed it once to their eldest son on the boy's 21st birthday, and he told him the whole story, the ballroom, the orange trees, the 4 seconds, the small library, the gray wool, the bees. The son, who was 21 and serious, listened the whole way through, and at the end he said, "Father, what is the lesson?" The Duke considered. He said, "The lesson, my dear, is that the sentences you speak in rooms you think are private are heard, always, by the person you would least wish to hear them, and that this is, on the whole, a mercy, because it gives you a chance, if you are quick enough, to become the person you would prefer to have been when you said them." The son said, 4 seconds. The Duke said, 4 seconds, if you are lucky. The son said, "And if you are not?" The Duke said, "Then a lifetime, and you spend it earning back what 4 seconds would have spared you." The son thought about this for a long time. He went away, and, by all reports, lived accordingly. And on the last evening of that autumn, after the children were asleep, and the household had gone quiet, Marisol and the Duke sat together in the small library at Harden House, where there had once been a meeting at 4 o'clock with an unlit fire, and the fire, this time, was lit, and she was reading a book about the management of moors that her sister had recommended, and he was, with the slow, patient pleasure of a man who had learned the habit late, reading a book about the keeping of bees. He looked up. He said, "Marisol," she said. "Theo," he said. "Nothing in particular. I only wanted to say your name in a quiet room." She inclined her head the smallest possible degree, and she went on reading, and he went on reading, and the fire, between them, did the small honest work of fires, which is to give light without commentary and warmth without conditions. And somewhere in the house a clock struck, very gently, the hour. And so, my friend by the fire, That is the story of a sentence spoken too loud in a ballroom, and a woman behind the orange trees who counted to 4, and a debt that became, in the end, a household. If you have ever stood unseen in a room while someone said a careless thing about you and felt the small cold weight of being underestimated settle on your shoulders, and counted, quietly, the seconds it took for your breath to return to its proper rhythm, then you already know everything that mattered to Marisol that night, and you already know, I suspect, the kind of person you became in those counted seconds, whether anyone in the room knew it or not. Tell me, if you would, which moment stayed with you? Was it the 4 counted seconds behind the orange trees, the third Duchess holding her folded paper and the painted lace, the unlit fire in the small library at 4 o'clock, or the quiet room at the end with the 2 books and the gentle clock? I would like to know, because the stories we choose to remember are, in the end, the stories we are quietly writing about ourselves. And if you would care to sit by this fire again, when the next story is ready, you are welcome here. There is always a chair kept for you, and the kettle is, as ever, near to boiling, and there are a great many sentences in this world spoken too loudly in ballrooms, and a great many women and men behind a great many orange trees, counting. Stay warm. Sleep gently. I will see you by the fire.